Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Tonight we begin with a chilling, extended submission from a viewer named Mark, who grew up in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of coastal Massachusetts, a town that held a secret whispered only after dark. A crumbling, ivy-choked structure known simply as Blackwood Manor. Blackwood wasn't just old, it was ancient, predating the American Revolution, built atop a granite hill where the locals claimed the soil itself rejected life, and whispers persisted for generations that no family had ever managed to stay within its walls for more than a single, unsettling year. The common thread being a chilling consensus that the house was not merely haunted, but truly, deeply hungry. Mark and his two college friends, foolishly fueled by cheap beer and a sense of youthful invincibility, saw the notorious abandoned manor as the ultimate, necessary challenge, a local rite of passage they felt obligated to conquer. And one late Friday night, they drove up the winding, overgrown path, armed with cheap, sputtering flashlights and a shaky digital camera, finally breaking the town's most sacred, unspoken rule by forcing open the massive, rotting front door. The moment the heavy oak door groaned shut with a hollow, echoing thump behind them, the world outside vanished and the air immediately changed. The warmth of the summer night was instantly replaced by an unnatural, cutting cold, the kind that feels like someone's breathing a sigh of pure frost right onto the back of your neck. They started on the ground floor, cracking desperate, nervous jokes, trying to ignore the frantic pulse already hammering in their chests, moving through dusty, vast rooms frozen in a forgotten time, with moth-eaten furniture and crumbling portraits. But as they started to climb the grand, creaking staircase to the second floor, the last vestiges of their laughter evaporated, replaced by a profound, consuming silence. Mark remembers the complete absence of natural noise more than anything else. It was not the peaceful silence of an empty building, but the suffocating, deep silence of a predator that has perfectly concealed itself and is now patiently waiting. Pause 2 seconds. On the landing of the second floor, in the long, dark hallway, a single water-damaged portrait hung conspicuously crookedly, and though the darkness was too thick to see the subject's face, Mark suddenly felt an overwhelming heavy pressure, the distinct, sickening sensation of being aggressively scrutinized, every fiber of his being exposed and judged. He turned to his friend Mike, his voice catching in his throat as he whispered, "We need to go now." And Mike, pale and clearly battling intense nausea, just nodded a silent, frantic affirmation. But before they could manage to take a single step back toward the stairs, a sound echoed from the absolute, crushing darkness at the far end of the hall, a single, heavy, deliberate thud, like something large and impossibly solid had been forcefully dropped onto the wooden floor, followed by an immediate return to the terrifying, breathless silence. They were utterly frozen, every nerve ending screaming a single word: "Run!" Mark's trembling hand raised his weak flashlight beam towards the sound, but the light seemed to shrink and die upon hitting the oppressive gloom. Then, the realization came. It moved. Not a footstep or a sound of movement, but a terrifying visual distortion. Against the far wall, where the light seemed actively absorbed, a deeper, more profound shadow began to form, a patch of absolute blackness that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. And this wasn't just a shadow. It had a chilling, unmistakable shape, impossibly tall, terrifyingly thin, and standing with a defined, unnatural posture, like a terrifying two-dimensional ink spill against a canvas of deeper dark, clearly blocking the only clear path back down the stairs, trapping them. Without warning, the creature moved, not walking or running, but gliding, a smooth, silent sweep of blackness. And as it approached, the air around them became intensely, physically thick, like wading through water or heavy oil, forcing Mark to gasp violently for a breath that wouldn't come. In a surge of pure, animalistic terror, Mark finally found his voice, a ragged scream. "Run! Get to the back room, now!" They spun and stumbled blindly, shoving into a small, dusty library, pushing the heavy, scarred door shut, and desperately jamming a broken chair beneath the knob, knowing the wood was too old and thin to hold anything back. Huddled together, the flashlight beam shaking so violently it was useless, they could hear the creature now, not on the floor, but on the door itself, and it was not scratching or pounding violently, but making a controlled, terrifying noise. It sounded like a heavy, impossibly cold hand being dragged slowly, deliberately, across the rough, splintered wood. Scrappy. It was a sound that promised not a quick death, but pure, protracted, and simple suffering. The horrible, dragging sound stopped. Pause. 3 seconds. The resulting silence was 1,000 times worse than the noise, forcing them to remain motionless for an endless minute. And Mark finally risked a peek through a crack in the door, seeing nothing but the heavy, crushing blackness of the hallway. "Go! Now!" he hissed, and they burst out, sprinting, not looking back, flying down the creaking staircase, crashing into the front door, using all their adrenaline to wrench the swollen wood open, and finally, mercifully, spilling out into the cool, clean night air, collapsing onto the lawn, too terrified and stunned to speak, simply watching the dark, monolithic silhouette of Blackwood Manor against the moon. They swore never to speak of it again, but Mark's encounter wasn't fully over, because the next morning, when he was finally calm enough to shower, he found something on his back just below his right shoulder blade. It wasn't a scratch from the fall, but 3 perfect parallel lines, red, raised, and stinging with an electric, unnatural cold. A mark. Mark spent years trying to rationalize it away. A splinter, a simple scrape, anything but the truth. But the mark was too clean, too deliberate, and his doctors had no explanation, leaving him with the terrifying, absolute conviction that the predatory creature in Blackwood Manor didn't just watch them, it touched them, a piece of the pure darkness that followed him home. And every time the temperature inexplicably drops, or he feels a sudden, profound chill in an empty room, he instinctively reaches back, touching those 3 perfect, parallel lines, because the scar is a permanent, chilling reminder that sometimes you don't just leave a truly haunted place behind. A piece of it comes, permanently, with you. Sighs. This terrifying true account was submitted by a man named David, a long-haul truck driver who spent years navigating the late-night routes through the forgotten stretches of rural Ohio, a route that cut through a desolate and unnervingly quiet area near a decaying local landmark known as the Old Iron Bridge, a notorious and locally feared spot that had witnessed dozens of inexplicable accidents, not to mention strange sightings over the decades, the focus of the terror always being the dark, abandoned railway tunnel that ran beneath the bridge. The local legend in the few remaining nearby towns claimed that the tunnel was an entrance to something not quite right, a place where residual energy, or even the very fabric of time itself, had become irreparably twisted, and those foolish enough to walk near its perpetual black mouth often reported hearing whispers or feeling a violent, unseen force physically shove them away. Sound, faint, distorted whisper ambience. One clear, cold night, around 3 a.m., David, who was usually stoic and practical, had been forced to pull his massive rig over just beside the bridge, convinced he heard a flat tire developing, which was strange since the truck had been serviced just that afternoon. And as he stepped out onto the gravel shoulder and shone his heavy-duty flashlight toward the trailer tires, a sudden, profoundly sickening wave of pure dread washed over him, making the fine hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stand straight up, despite the surprising mildness of the early morning. Instinctively, he raised the light toward the tunnel entrance, and at first he saw only the crumbling, black-stained brick and the impossible void of the opening. But then, he noticed the air inside the tunnel was unnaturally disturbed. It wasn't wind, but a bizarre, oily, visible shimmering distortion, like heat rising violently off extremely hot asphalt, except this phenomenon was accompanied by an immediate and intense freezing cold that made his breath catch in his chest. David found himself completely paralyzed, his muscles locked by a terror he couldn't explain, as he stared, utterly helpless, while the shimmering intensified, seeming to compact and condense until it slowly, deliberately, stepped out of the tunnel's mouth. Voice slow, wide-eyed. The entity took on a vaguely humanoid form, though it was utterly devoid of color or light, a figure of pure, terrifying visual static, like a massive, constantly shifting broken television signal moving ponderously toward him. Yet it was undeniably powerful, aware, and focused. This impossible thing did not have discernible eyes, but David felt its focused, hungry attention lock onto him with the physical weight of a 1,000-pound anchor, and then, slowly, agonizingly, it emitted a sound that was not loud in the conventional sense, but felt like an unbearable, drilling pressure building inside his skull. A high-pitched sound, loud electronic shriek, static burst. Electronic shriek mixed with a desperate, guttural sighing sound, a chilling, powerful noise he instantly identified in his mind as the tunnel's breath, demanding his immediate and absolute attention. David finally broke free of the paralysis in a blind, absolute panic, forgetting the tires completely, scrambling back into his cab, slamming the heavy door, and flooring the gas pedal. The massive truck tires spitting gravel as he tore away from the bridge, and the terrifying static figure, which he watched in the side mirror, slowly dissolve back into the palpable gloom of the tunnel entrance. He drove for over 70 miles, his heart slamming against his ribs, before he could slow down and begin to breathe anything resembling a normal rhythm, swearing to himself he would never, under any circumstance, drive that route again. When he finally pulled into a greasy diner. Much later that morning and checked his truck, the tires were all perfectly fine, but when he inspected the metal beside the gas tank, the area closest to the tunnel, he found the thick steel was strangely and visibly warped, almost melted in one small spot, and unnaturally ice-cold to the touch, a physical impossibility that defied logic. For weeks and months afterward, even after he changed routes and tried to forget the terrifying encounter, David would sometimes wake up in the dead of night, utterly alone, and hear a faint, distant, metallic sighing sound deep in the back of his mind, whisper. A constant, chilling reminder of the powerful predatory entity that almost successfully dragged him into the distortion beneath the notorious Old Iron Bridge, an entity that was not a ghost, but something far, far worse. Sound static fade to silence,